April 1945. The war in Europe is collapsing. At a small train depot outside Le Havre, France, a group of exhausted German women, auxiliary nurses, secretaries, and communication staff are herded into open trucks. Their uniforms are wrinkled, insignias stripped, faces hollow. For years they were told that capture by the Americans meant degradation, starvation, or worse. Now they're being shipped across the Atlantic, to the land of the enemy. 2 weeks later, before dawn, the convoy halts inside a fenced compound in Texas. The desert air is dry. A bell rings from a low wooden barrack. Smoke rises from the mess hall chimney. Then an unfamiliar scent drifts through the camp. Rich, savory, unmistakable. Bacon. One of the women freezes mid-step. Another looks up, confused. They exchange silent glances. The guards aren't shouting. The kitchen doors are open. Inside, American soldiers laugh over breakfast trays piled with eggs, toast, and coffee. For the first time since their surrender, the women realize something unthinkable. They are not prisoners in the way they imagined. The war had shown them brutality, but captivity might show them something else entirely. By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany was disintegrating under the relentless pressure of the Allied advance. From the Western Front, the U.S. and British armies were pushing deep into the Rhineland, while from the east, the Red Army was tearing through Silesia and Brandenburg. For the German people, and especially for those serving in auxiliary military roles, the end came not with ceremony but with confusion, hunger, and disbelief. As the Reich collapsed, tens of thousands of women found themselves in uniform, not as frontline soldiers, but as clerks, radio operators, nurses, and secretaries supporting the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe. Many of them were members of the Nachrichtenhelferinnen, the Female Communications Corps, or the Blitzmädel, the so-called lightning girls who manned the radios, telephone lines, and anti-aircraft logistics centers. They worked in command bunkers on airfields and in field hospitals, all under the belief that they were serving the fatherland in vital, if secondary, roles. When the Allied forces breached Germany's western borders, these women suddenly became part of the retreating machinery of war. The Wehrmacht was in shambles. Supply lines were severed. Commanders were surrendering divisions wholesale. Civilians and auxiliaries alike were swept into chaos. By late April, U.S. forces had captured over 300,000 German personnel in the Western Theater. Among them were thousands of women, nurses from field hospitals in Belgium and France, radio operators from Luftwaffe stations, and clerical staff pulled from collapsing headquarters. Most were young, between 18 and 25. Many had never seen battle directly, but they were now categorized as prisoners of war. The American command was unprepared for the sheer volume of captives. Europe was overcrowded and resources were stretched thin. The U.S. government faced a logistical nightmare. Hundreds of thousands of German POWs were flooding in faster than Europe could feed them. The solution came from across the Atlantic. Starting in 1943, the United States had already built a network of over 500 POW camps spread across its territory, from Texas to Iowa, from Georgia to Oregon. These camps were designed to house captured soldiers from North Africa and Europe, primarily Germans and Italians. By the time the war ended, more than 425,000 Axis prisoners were living on American soil, guarded, fed, and surprisingly, well treated under the Geneva Convention of 1929. Most of these prisoners were men, Wehrmacht, Afrika Korps, or U-boat crews. But by mid-1945, small groups of female auxiliaries began arriving as well, transferred under the same legal protections. Though their presence was relatively rare, their arrival carried symbolic weight. Women who had once worked for the Nazi war machine were now standing inside a country they'd been taught to fear. The conditions that awaited them were not what they expected. At the height of the war, Nazi propaganda had depicted Americans as savages, morally corrupt, racially degenerate, driven by greed and revenge. Women in uniform were warned that capture by the Allies would mean violation and death. Those rumors spread like wildfire among the ranks, so when these women found themselves disarmed, loaded onto ships and sent west, most were convinced they would never return. Instead, they disembarked to a landscape that felt almost alien. Clean barracks, open fields, organized routines. Texas camps like Camp Hearn, Camp Swift, and Camp Huntsville were typical examples. Each facility contained barracks, mess halls, libraries, and even small theaters. Prisoners were issued bedding, clothing, and food, identical to U.S. Army rations. They were paid modest wages for labor, given access to sports, and allowed to send mail home through the Red Cross. For the American government, the treatment was deliberate. The goal wasn't kindness, and it was control. A content prisoner was a compliant prisoner. But for those who had spent years under totalitarian command, indoctrination and scarcity, the psychological effect was profound. The smell of bacon wasn't just about food, it was about contrast. It symbolized the chasm between what they'd been told and what they saw. Between propaganda and reality. Between the Reich that demanded sacrifice and the enemy that offered breakfast. This dissonance marked the start of a mental shift, one that rippled through thousands of captured Germans, reshaping their view of the world and of themselves. The irony was unmistakable. In defeat, they were beginning to understand freedom, and that freedom, even within barbed wire, had a taste. For many of the German women brought to the United States, the first shock wasn't the guards, the fences, or the uniforms. It was breakfast. After weeks of transport across the Atlantic in converted Liberty ships, the prisoners stepped off the gangplanks exhausted and emaciated. They had lived for years under rationing and scarcity. Their diet in wartime Germany reduced to black bread, ersatz coffee, and watery soups. Inside the camps, the first morning meal offered by the U.S. Army was a revelation. Fresh eggs, white bread, milk, butter, and bacon. To a nation that had just lost everything, it was a sensory jolt. The scent of sizzling meat in an orderly mess hall, the clean uniforms of American cooks, and the absurd normalcy of abundance. Some of the women reportedly cried, not from joy but confusion. They had been told Americans were monsters. Instead, they were feeding them like guests. The U.S. military followed the Geneva Convention to the letter, but often exceeded it. Each prisoner received 3,000 to 3,600 calories a day, the same as an American soldier. The reasoning was pragmatic. The U.S. economy was booming, and food supplies were plentiful. Feeding prisoners well was both humane and strategic, a subtle weapon of influence in a war of ideologies. Inside the camps, German order met American efficiency. The prisoners organized themselves into miniature societies. Officers oversaw discipline while non-coms managed daily routines. There were classes, sports leagues, and orchestras. Even within captivity, the Germans replicated the only system they knew: hierarchy and structure. But the female POWs, though few, existed in a different social bubble. Most were kept in separate compounds or assigned to work details away from male prisoners. Their roles ranged from clerical work to hospital assistants under U.S. supervision. Unlike the frontline men, these women were often well-educated, articulate, and for the first time in years, beyond the shadow of Nazi command. Their American overseers noticed the change immediately. Reports from Camp Trinidad in Colorado and Camp Ruston in Louisiana described the German women as courteous, disciplined, and remarkably industrious. Many expressed disbelief at the cleanliness of the facilities. One woman, a Luftwaffe typist captured in France, later recounted that the camp laundry smelled better than any home in Germany during the war. For the U.S. Army, the moral calculus was simple: demonstrate the contrast between democratic civility and totalitarian decay. In the propaganda war that continued beyond the battlefield, every well-fed, well-treated German was a potential future advocate for American values. Still, not everything was idyllic. Some of the women carried deep guilt. They had served the Reich. They had seen its machinery of war. And now they were living in a land their country had sworn to destroy. In quiet moments, shame crept in, especially when they learned what had happened back home: the bombings of Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin, the collapse of the regime, the revelations of concentration camps. News trickled through Red Cross bulletins and American newspapers available in camp libraries. For many, it shattered everything they believed. Some reacted with denial, others with silence. But a growing number began to question what they had fought for. At Camp Hearn, a Red Cross visitor recorded an interaction that captured the moral dissonance perfectly. A young German woman, formerly a radio operator, asked if the reports about concentration camps were enemy lies. The visitor pointed to American newspapers and photographs. The woman said nothing, only stared, then asked softly, "Why didn't they tell us?" That question, "Why didn't they tell us?" became a haunting refrain among many captured Germans. It was in these fenced compounds thousands of miles from Europe that the ideological fabric of Nazism began to unravel in real time. The bacon at breakfast, the books in the library, the freedom to question without punishment, these weren't luxuries. They were demonstrations. Proof that the enemy they'd been taught to hate operated under a different code. In the sterile quiet of an American prison camp, Germany's defeated youth were experiencing democracy for the first time. And while the war outside had ended, inside these fences, another battle had just begun, the battle for the German mind. To understand the transformation that took place inside these camps, you must look at it from several angles and human, moral, political, psychological, and logistical. Each reveals how something as simple as a breakfast of bacon and eggs became a weapon more effective than any rifle. The human angle, from enemy to individual. When the war ended, over 370,000 German POWs were held across the United States. Among them, only a small fraction were women, nurses, clerks, auxiliaries, translators, or administrative personnel captured in Western Europe. They had served not as soldiers, but as cogs in the machinery of war. At first, they feared the worst. Nazi propaganda had painted a picture of Americans as barbaric occupiers who tortured, humiliated, and executed prisoners. Instead, they found discipline, fairness, and something more powerful, human dignity. The first encounter with American camp guards shattered the indoctrinated image of the enemy. The men were firm but polite, often addressing them as Miss or Fräulein. That level of respect was unheard of in the Nazi military structure, where subordination was absolute and women were tools of the state. Gradually, fear gave way to confusion, then gratitude. Many later wrote in memoirs or interviews that the Americans' restraint and kindness had broken something inside, the blind loyalty they had carried for years. It wasn't re-education through lectures. It was re-education through conduct. The smell of bacon, the orderliness of meals, the cleanliness of the barracks, they all communicated a message. This is what civilization looks like when power is used without cruelty. The moral angle, the war of ethics, the U.S. approach to handling POWs was not driven by charity but by principle. The Geneva Convention of 1929 mandated humane treatment, but Washington went beyond compliance. Feeding the enemy well while Americans rationed at home was politically risky. There were protests from U.S. citizens who couldn't understand why Nazis were eating better than some American families. But the War Department held its ground. The logic was strategic. How the U.S. treated its captives would determine how American prisoners were treated abroad, and would shape post-war diplomacy. There was also a moral undercurrent. President Roosevelt's administration viewed humane treatment as a moral differentiator, a line between democracy and dictatorship. If Germany represented the darkness of ideology, America would represent the light of conduct. This contrast didn't go unnoticed by the German prisoners. They began to question why a supposed enemy of the Aryan race was feeding them, housing them and protecting them, not because they were useful, but because it was right. The bacon that sizzled in those camp kitchens wasn't just food. It was propaganda in its most disarming form, the taste of decency. The psychological angle, the quiet collapse of indoctrination. For years, Nazi Germany had weaponized psychology. Indoctrination was constant, from childhood through adulthood, with the message that loyalty to the Führer was sacred. That system relied on fear, conformity, and isolation. But captivity in America stripped away those pillars. The women were cut off from their superiors, free from daily propaganda and exposed to a stable, democratic system operating with efficiency but without tyranny. Psychologists who studied POW behavior later described this as a controlled collapse of ideology. Without coercion, the prisoners began reassessing their beliefs. The camp libraries, stocked with German translations of American literature, from Steinbeck to Whitman, became quiet battlegrounds of ideas. Some resisted change, others embraced it. but nearly all were affected. By 1946, thousands of POWs were participating in voluntary discussion groups known as democracy classes. Though not all camps had them, those that did reported measurable attitude shifts. Prisoners began expressing admiration for the fairness of American institutions. One U.S. intelligence officer summarized it perfectly. "We captured their bodies in France, but we conquered their minds in Texas." What emerged from these camps were not hardened Nazis, but witnesses, men and women who had seen the moral contrast firsthand. And for many of them, that contrast began with something as small and ordinary as the smell of breakfast in a land without bombings. The cultural angle, the power of routine and order for the German prisoners. Camp life was an unexpected paradox. Confinement wrapped in structure. American military discipline was firm but not cruel. There were daily routines, clean schedules, and clear expectations. To those who had lived under the fear-driven chaos of Nazi command, this order felt almost civilized. The day often began early. Around 6 a.m., the smell of breakfast, bacon, coffee, and freshly baked bread carried across the compound. After roll call, prisoners cleaned their quarters, tended to camp gardens, or were assigned light labor in local factories or farms. This structured life did something remarkable. It restored dignity. The Germans had been stripped of purpose by defeat, but the Americans gave them tasks, not punishments. Even small gestures had deep psychological effects. Allowing POWs to organize orchestras, publish newsletters, or stage plays wasn't leniency. It was social engineering. The War Department understood that a functioning mind was easier to influence than a broken one. Music especially became a cultural bridge. In several camps, German women who had been Red Cross nurses organized choral performances, sometimes attended by American officers. These events were both therapeutic and symbolic, a merging of two civilizations that had only months earlier tried to annihilate each other. In their memoirs, several former female POWs later recalled how the Americans' emphasis on cleanliness, punctuality, and civility mirrored aspects of pre-war German discipline, but without the ideological poison. It felt familiar yet liberating. They weren't prisoners of cruelty. They were captives of order. The economic angle, work, worth, and reciprocity. By 1944, the U.S. faced a severe labor shortage. Millions of men were overseas, and the home front economy depended on filling the gaps. POW labor became an essential part of that equation. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could work, but only under humane conditions and for fair compensation. Many camps arranged for prisoners to assist in agriculture, logging, and manufacturing, earning small credits redeemable for goods at the camp canteen. This arrangement was mutually beneficial. Farmers got reliable help. Prisoners gained a sense of usefulness. For the women, especially nurses and clerks, tasks often involved medical record keeping, textile work, or kitchen management. Work reduced hostility and instilled a strange form of pride. They were still prisoners, but they were contributing to something functional. The psychological effect was profound, and they no longer saw themselves as disposable. Red Cross report noted that German POWs often performed with voluntary precision exceeding expectation. That wasn't submission, it was cultural, identity resurfacing under fair treatment. Ironically, America had done something Nazi Germany never managed. It made these individuals feel respected through responsibility. The political angle, America's soft power experiment, the POW program became one of the most successful psychological operations of World War II, not by design, but by consequence. The War Department realized early that these camps could serve as incubators for post-war reconstruction. Treating German POWs humanely wasn't just about ethics, it was about shaping the future of Germany itself. By 1945, the United States had already begun identifying prisoners who could become pro-democratic voices back home. Many were educated women, clerks, nurses, translators, who had experienced both the tyranny of the Reich and the fairness of American authority. For these women, their time in captivity became a moral reference point. When they returned to a devastated Germany, they carried memories that contradicted Nazi propaganda. Some would later testify that they learned democracy in captivity. The policy paid off. Post-war German society, especially in the American zone, rebuilt itself around ideals of order, fairness, and individual rights. Many of those values had been demonstrated, not taught, inside the very camps meant for their detention. And so the smell of bacon, the sound of music, the structure of daily work, all of it became part of a quiet reprogramming. America had waged a psychological war that ended not with bombs, but with breakfast. The moral dissonance planted in those camps was growing, and it would soon reach its decisive moment. The turning point wasn't a battle or a speech. It came when the prisoners realized that captivity could feel freer than the ideology they'd once served. The decisive moment came not through confrontation, but through quiet awakening. It was December 1944, deep winter across the southern United States. The war in Europe was raging toward its brutal conclusion, and news of the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, had reached even the most remote American POW camps. For the German women interned in places like Camp Hearn, Camp Swift, and Camp Trinidad, the reports hit hard. Their homeland was burning again. Inside the camps, tension thickened. Radios blared updates. Some prisoners refused to eat. Others gathered in whispers, clutching fading photos from home. Yet amid the anxiety, something unexpected happened. Empathy began to flow in both directions. American guards, many of whom had German ancestry themselves, started showing quiet compassion. One morning, as temperatures dropped near freezing, the kitchen staff decided to serve the prisoners extra portions: scrambled eggs, bacon, and coffee. It wasn't in the rulebook. It was simply human decency. When the trays were placed on the tables, the women didn't move at first. They stared at the food as if it were an illusion. Some had grown up during the Depression. Others had seen civilians starve on the Eastern Front. The smell of warm bacon in captivity felt like a betrayal of logic. A former prisoner, Erika von Holt, later wrote in a post-war diary entry, "We sat in silence, listening to the sound of bacon crackling on the grill. I wanted to hate them, to remember what they had done to Germany, but I couldn't. It was too human, too kind." That morning marked a psychological rupture. The propaganda of the Reich, the image of the barbaric American, collapsed under the weight of one shared meal. The guards noticed it too. One lieutenant wrote in a camp report from Camp Hearn, "The women appeared calmer today. They smiled more. They offered to help clean the kitchen without being asked." It was an ordinary morning that quietly dismantled years of conditioning. As the months passed, these gestures multiplied. A nurse from Hamburg began volunteering in the camp infirmary, assisting American medics treating prisoners with frostbite. A young clerk translated English labels into German for newly arrived POWs. The walls between captor and captive were eroding, not through diplomacy but through decency. And yet the news from Europe grew darker. Reports of Allied bombings, the fall of Aachen, and the chaos in the Ruhr poured in daily. The women wrestled with guilt, safe, fed, and sheltered while their country was reduced to rubble. That emotional conflict came to a head one Sunday morning. The camp chaplain, a Methodist minister from Iowa, announced a Christmas service and invited everyone, prisoners included. For the first time, German hymns were sung openly under the Texas sky. When Stille Nacht began, something cracked. The American soldiers lowered their heads. The prisoners wept quietly. The chapel filled with the sound of voices that for once didn't belong to enemies. That moment became the emotional fulcrum of the entire POW experience. It wasn't forgiveness, and it was recognition. Humanity, stripped of ideology. Later that day, the Americans organized a Christmas dinner. Roast turkey, mashed potatoes, gravy, and yes, bacon again. One prisoner, a young woman named Margaret Kessler, later told an interviewer in 1952, "That was the first time I realized I could never go back to what I believed before the war." The Americans didn't defeat us with weapons. They defeated us with kindness. In that statement lies the true climax, and not a battle, but a transformation. The U.S. camps had unwittingly become laboratories of re-education. The prisoners weren't told to change. They were shown another way to live. Discipline without fear, strength without cruelty, patriotism without hatred. This realization didn't happen overnight. It unfolded through repetition. Every breakfast, every orderly roll call, every act of fairness. Each small moment chipped away at a lifetime of indoctrination. By spring 1945, many of these women had stopped calling themselves soldiers of the Reich. They referred to themselves simply as workers and nurses or women. The identity they had been forced to wear, tools of a totalitarian machine, and was quietly fading. The moment of surrender that mattered most wasn't Germany's, it was theirs, and it happened improbably behind barbed wire over the smell of bacon and coffee. By April 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing. The camps were no longer just holding centers. They were classrooms of democracy in action. April 1945. The world was ending, at least for the Reich. Across the Atlantic, the radio crackled through static in the recreation barracks of Camp Herne. News bulletins carried grim headlines: Hitler entrapped in Berlin, Dresden in rounds, the Americans crossing the Elbe. The young German women sat frozen, clutching tin mugs of coffee, faces pale and distant. For many, the war that had shaped their entire identity was now disintegrating in real time. Some whispered questions. Was the Führer still alive? Would the Allies destroy all of Germany? Others simply stared at the horizon, silent. The guards didn't interrupt. They'd seen this before. The hollow look of soldiers who had lost not just a war but a worldview. That week, the camp commandant, Major Robert E. Wilson, issued new orders. All incoming news must be shared openly with the POWs. It was a radical decision for the time. Transparency instead of censorship. He believed that if these women were ever to return home changed, they had to see truth unfiltered. So the bulletins kept coming. Photos of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Nordhausen circulated among the prisoners. Some refused to believe them. American lies, they murmured. But as the images piled up, denial became impossible. One nurse, Lieselotte Kruger, broke down while translating an English newspaper for the others. "If this is true," she whispered, "then we served monsters." It was the collapse of ideology, not through interrogation, but revelation. The women had entered captivity believing themselves victims. Now they were confronting the brutal truth that they had been part of something far worse. The Americans handled it with quiet precision. No lectures, no moral sermons. Instead, they doubled down on consistency, discipline, fairness, humanity. Every rule remained in place, but every punishment was proportional. The message was implicit. Power doesn't have to humiliate. Inside the mess hall, the meals continued. Coffee, oatmeal, bread, bacon on Sundays. It sounds trivial, but to these prisoners, food became the language of morality. The same nation that had bombed their cities still fed them 3 times a day. The psychological impact was devastating and transformative. By May 1945, the German Reich ceased to exist. On May 8th, when word of the unconditional surrender reached Texas, the camp fell silent. The American flag rose to half-mast, not in victory but respect. A local chaplain gave a short speech. "The war's over. May the peace begin here." Some prisoners wept. Others stared blankly. A few even saluted the American officers, not in subservience, but acknowledgement. That night, as the kitchen prepared one final celebratory meal, the same smell drifted again through the barracks, bacon and coffee. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The same scent that had once triggered fear now meant peace, survival, and even gratitude. For the German women, the emotional climax wasn't about defeat. It was about awakening. One of them, Anna Fisher, later testified to a U.S. War Department interviewer, "I didn't know what freedom felt like until I was a prisoner." That paradox defined their transformation. They had lived under dictatorship but discovered liberty behind fences. They had been taught hatred but experienced compassion from their supposed enemies. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, American authorities began preparing for repatriation. The women were interviewed, medically examined, and issued clean uniforms with POWs stenciled neatly on the back. Many were healthier than when they'd arrived. Some even gained weight, a fact that shocked the Red Cross inspectors who visited. When representatives from the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, visited in June 1945, they were astonished. Reports described the American women's and men's camps as models of humane treatment and discipline. The German prisoners themselves corroborated it. A Red Cross officer wrote, "Many of the female prisoners refer to this place as a paradise compared to conditions in Europe. They have difficulty reconciling this treatment with the image of America they were taught. The guards, too, were changed. Many were young men who had never left their home states before the war. Now they found themselves managing women their own age. Many fluent in English, many educated. Over time, respect replaced suspicion. Some prisoners began teaching German to their guards. Others knitted sweaters for local orphans. The barbed wire still stood, but its meaning had shifted, from separation to safety. By late summer, the emotional balance had reversed. The prisoners dreaded going home. They didn't know what awaited them: hunger, revenge, ruin. Some even requested to stay, but international law forbade it. By the 1960s, the U.S. Army's military, police, and intelligence handbooks included a new philosophy for handling detainees, directly inspired by the POW system. It emphasized discipline without brutality, order without humiliation, and humane conditions as a strategic tool. In bureaucratic shorthand, this was labeled the Hearn Principle. Most soldiers never knew where the term came from. But buried in declassified memos decades later, the phrasing was explicit. The treatment of Axis prisoners, specifically German female personnel, demonstrated that moral exposure yields more stable ideological collapse than physical coercion. In corporate speak, America had weaponized empathy. And yet, for the women who once lived it, it wasn't strategy. It was survival. Many of them would spend the rest of their lives explaining that their gratitude didn't erase the war or justify their nation's crimes. But it did remind them, and anyone who would listen, that civilization doesn't vanish just because a flag falls. One of them, Erica Brandt, wrote in a letter to her daughter in 1968, "The smell of bacon doesn't mean America to me. It means decency." That was the real headline. The story of German women POWs in America wasn't about indulgence or comfort. It was about proof. Proof that even in total war, moral consistency is not a luxury. It's a weapon. The fences of Camp Hearn are gone now. Grass has swallowed the ground where barracks once stood. A small museum marks the spot, a quiet patch of Texas soil that once held the enemy and changed them forever. And in that silence, one truth remains unshaken. Sometimes, the strongest act of war is refusing to become like the enemy you defeat. History remembers tanks, treaties, and generals. But the real revolutions, and the ones that change how nations think, happen in quiet places. Camp Hearn was one of them. No parades, no medals, no slogans. Just order, food, and decency delivered with consistency. In a century defined by brutality, America's treatment of its German POWs, especially the women, stood out as a contradiction. It proved that a democracy at war could still behave like a democracy. That mercy didn't weaken power. It clarified it. Those camps were more than holding facilities. They were psychological laboratories. Without ever declaring it, the U.S. had discovered a truth every empire learns too late. You can dominate a body, but you can only convert a mind through dignity. That lesson would echo through the Cold War. Vietnam, Iraq, every conflict where ideology mattered more than territory. But the blueprint came from those barbed wire fields in Texas, from the smell of bacon and the echo of fairness that followed it across oceans. For the women who survived it, that experience rewired their sense of the world. They had seen what civilization looked like, not in speeches but in soap, clean sheets, and the absence of fear. And in that realization lies the paradox of war, that sometimes the victors who show restraint end up rewriting the moral code of their time. History's loudest moments often start in silence, and on a cold Texas morning in 1944, that silence smelled like breakfast and the beginning of a better kind of power.